Have you ever wondered why women of the 19th century voluntarily encased themselves in steel cages? We're told it was fashion. We're told it was style, aesthetics, a whim of wealthy ladies wanting to accentuate their waists. But stop for a second and engage your critical thinking. Do you really believe that for the sake of dubious beauty, millions of women around the world agreed to wear heavy steel and whalebone contraptions on themselves that made normal sitting, passing through doors, and even basic hygiene impossible? You've been deceived. Official history feeds us a sweet lie about Victorian fashion to hide one of the most terrifying secrets of the past. The truth is that the crinoline was not clothing. It never was clothing. What we see in old daguerreotypes and paintings is a sophisticated engineering structure, a technical framework whose functional purpose was vital for the survival of the biological species. Look closely at the structure of the crinoline. Remove the lace, remove the silk and velvet that later settlers tried to drape over the constructions they didn't understand. What do you see? It's a perfect Faraday cage. It's a closed metal contour encircling the lower part of the body. Why? The answer is obvious if we stop looking at history through the rose-tinted glasses of school textbooks and examine the physics of the process. Which part of the body does this framework protect first and foremost? The reproductive organs, the uterus, future offspring. We're dealing with an era when atmospheric electricity, or as the ancients called it, ether, was at peak, deadly dangerous levels. Historians try to convince us that these dresses were just inconvenient. But let's look at the numbers and facts. In the mid-19th century, specifically in the 1850s, there was an explosive growth in the production of steel and wire specifically for the needs of the sewing industry. Ponder the absurdity of this claim. Metallurgical factories are working at full capacity, not for building bridges or railroads, but allegedly so that women could wear wide skirts. This is economic nonsense. No fashion can justify such colossal expenditures of metal and human resources, unless it's a matter of life and death. Imagine a world after a global catastrophe. A world where the electromagnetic background is off the charts. Being on the street without protection meant exposing your genetics to irreversible mutations or sterilization. Men, whose physiology and hormonal background differ, could endure this radiation differently, or used another hidden protection, which we'll discuss later. But women, carrying children, needed shielding. The metal frame of the crinoline, often made of steel hoops connected by conductive tapes, created a protective dome. This is 7th grade physics. The electric charge distributes over the surface of the conductor without penetrating inside. A woman inside the crinoline was in a zero potential zone. She was safe. But the scariest part of this story is how quickly we forgot the true purpose of these items. We behaved like savages who found an astronaut's spacesuit and decided to use it as a ritual garment, decorating it with beads and feathers. Those whom we call our ancestors from the 19th century were largely such savages, settlers. They came to the ruins of a highly advanced civilization, found warehouses with thousands of these frames, and, not understanding their technical essence, began wearing them, imitating images of gods or predecessors. They turned a means of radiation and wave protection into a grotesque carnival costume. Recall how often historical chronicles mention cases of crinolines catching fire. The official version states that wide skirts simply brushed against candles or fireplaces. This is a lie, designed to hide the true nature of the phenomena. The fabric didn't ignite from candles. It burst into flames from electrical discharges, from insulation breakdown when the accumulated static charge on the metal frame exceeded critical values. These were not household fires. These were man-made accidents of faulty protective equipment. Thousands of women burned alive not due to their clumsiness, but because the external electromagnetic background was so aggressive that even the protection couldn't withstand it, or because the settlers violated the integrity of the circuit while trying to re-sew the frame to fit their primitive tastes. We look at old photographs and laugh at their naivety. But who is really naive here? Those who survived in the conditions of a post-apocalyptic electromagnetic storm, or we, who believed that steel hoops weighing 11 to 22 pounds were worn to appear slimmer? Official history falls apart as soon as we start applying the logic of an engineer to it, rather than an art historian. Why exactly during this period did huge metal umbrellas appear? Why, in the architecture of that time, was there such an abundance of copper domes and spires, which are essentially giant atmospheric capacitors? All this is links in one chain. The crinoline is a portable version of protection, an individual bunker that allowed movement through contaminated terrain. Ponder where the technologies for mass production of the thinnest, flexible, yet incredibly strong steel for these hoops came from. The technology for producing such wire requires the most complex rolling mills and temperature regimes that, according to the official chronology, were hardly available in that volume and quality. We're told this was the progress of the Industrial Revolution, but the facts indicate that these were remnants of technologies from a previous era, hastily adapted for survival needs. Factories didn't invent anything new. They stamped copies from found blueprints, or simply restored discovered production lines. You must understand one thing. The history of fashion is one of the biggest falsifications. They substitute concepts for us, explaining functional, technical solutions as strange tastes of ancestors. But tastes don't form in a vacuum. No one would wear shackles for beauty. If society massively adopts an uncomfortable, heavy, expensive-to-produce clothing element, then there is a compelling, physical reason for it. And that reason is fear. Fear of an invisible enemy that permeated the air of that time. Ether that could kill an unborn child. Electricity that lingered in the atmosphere after the catastrophe. Let's delve into the technical documentation of what historians mistakenly call fashion. If we accept as an axiom that the crinoline is an engineering device, then every element of the wardrobe from that time instantly acquires a sinister but logical meaning. Look at the materials. What were dresses sewn from over the metal frame? Natural silk, taffeta, velvet. You would say luxury. I say insulation. Silk is one of the best natural dielectrics. In a world saturated with stray currents, wearing a steel cage against bare skin would be suicide. A powerful insulating layer was necessary. The multi-layered skirts worn under the frame and over it served as a dielectric spacer in the giant capacitor that, essentially, every woman of that era was. And now ask yourself the question that all costume researchers inexplicably ignore. If women were walking Faraday cages, then what function did men perform? Look at the men's suit of the mid-19th century. Tailcoat, top hat, cane. This is not dandy style. This is a grounding and static discharge kit. The top hat is not headwear. It's a resonator. Notice its shape. A tall tube with a flat top and brim. Inside many antique top hats that miraculously survived in private collections and didn't fall into the hands of museum falsifiers, traces of copper winding or thin metal mesh are found. The top hat worked as a receiving antenna, collecting excess potential from the upper body so it wouldn't strike the brain. And the long tails of the tailcoat? What were they for? Sitting on them is uncomfortable, they hinder walking. But if we look at them as conductors descending to the ground, everything falls into place. In the original, pre-flood constructions that the settlers found, Metal threads were sewn into the tails, running from the collar to the very bottom. This was a charge drainage system. And finally, the cane. An elegant accessory? No. This is a portable grounder. Canes of that time almost always had a metal knob and a metal tip, connected inside by a rod. When the atmospheric voltage became critical, the gentleman simply stuck the cane into the ground and grasped the knob with his bare hand, discharging the dangerous charge into the soil. That's why gloves were a mandatory attribute. They insulated the hands from accidental touching of energized objects, but were removed when grounding was necessary. We observe a classic cargo cult scheme. Settlers who came to empty cities after the catastrophe found warehouses with this special clothing. They saw images of the former owners, tall, beautiful, powerful, clad in these constructions. But the new inhabitants didn't understand the physics of the process. They put on crinolines, but forgot about proper insulation, leading to burns and deaths. They put on top hats, but removed the extra copper parts from them, turning a complex device into an empty cardboard box on the head. They took canes in hand, but used them simply for support, losing understanding that they held a life-saving lightning rod. Look at the ballrooms of that era. Huge spaces, high ceilings, gigantic crystal chandeliers. Crystal is a piezoelectric. We're told that thousands of candles were lit there. Do you even realize how much oxygen thousands of candles would consume in a closed room? People would suffocate within 20 minutes. No, these chandeliers didn't burn with fire. They glowed under the influence of that very etheric field, whose concentration in the halls was maximal. And now, imagine the dance. Hundreds of couples whirling in a single rhythm. Women in crinoline coils, men in tailcoat conductors. This is not entertainment. This is a process of generating or harmonizing energy. The rotation of metal contours in an electromagnetic field creates induction current. Balls were necessary not for social conversations, but to maintain the operation of some gigantic mechanisms of the building itself, or for collective charging or discharging of biological accumulators that people had become. The settlers tried to copy these rituals. They held balls, lit wax candles instead of ether lamps, and choked on soot, not understanding why they couldn't achieve that magical glow spoken of in legends. They turned a technological process into a vanity fair. But even in this distorted form, the system continued to operate at minimal speeds, protecting the reproductive functions of the population. That's why, despite the monstrous, unsanitary conditions and lack of medicine that historians tell us about, in the mid-19th century, there occurs an inexplicable demographic surge. The population begins to grow exponentially, as if someone turned on an incubator. And every woman wore this incubator on herself. Pay attention to how the shape of the crinoline changed. At first, it was a full dome, covering everything from the waist to the floor. Then, as the etheric background began to subside or change, the shape transformed. The bustle appeared, a construction protecting only the back and lower back. Why? Because the vector of the threat changed? Or because the main strikes of static electricity began to hit the rear hemisphere while walking? And by the beginning of the 20th century, when the background stabilized to safe levels, corsets and frames disappeared almost instantly. Historians will call this emancipation and a change in fashion. We see here a clear adherence to dosimeter readings. As soon as the level of external threat dropped, wearing heavy leaden armor became pointless. But there's one more nuance that makes it eerie. Children's clothing. Look at portraits of 19th century children. Boys up to a certain age, often up to 5 to 7 years old, wore dresses. We're told it was more convenient that way to change diapers. This is a lie for the feeble-minded. A 5-year-old child doesn't need diapers. The reason is different. Boys were dressed in dresses to hide their gender characteristics from selective radiation effects. Or, more likely, under children's dresses were hidden the same, but small, protective frames. Before puberty, a child's body was particularly vulnerable, and the division into male and female types of protection occurred only when the hormonal system began to work at full strength. We see a total civil defense system disguised as etiquette oddities. We live on a graveyard of technologies. What we call the Victorian era is a time of survival, a time of adaptation to a hostile environment left by a previous war of the gods or a planetary-scale natural cataclysm. People walked in spacesuits, lived in hermetic house stations, and used remnants of great knowledge just to avoid extinction. And they succeeded. But the price of this survival was high, a complete loss of memory about who they were and why they really needed these iron hoops under their skirts. We continue to wear remnants of this memory in the form of wedding dresses with crinolines, not even suspecting that we are putting on the bride a mock-up of a chemical and radiation protection suit. But the most interesting is yet to come. We are approaching the question of where these settlers came from and why they found the cities empty but fully ready for life. If the crinoline is a protective suit and the cities were empty, then who are we and where did we come from in this scenery? Look at panoramic shots of world capitals from the mid-19th century. Paris, St. Petersburg, Rome, Washington. What do you see? Emptiness. Deathly silence. Wide avenues designed for the movement of thousands stood absolutely deserted. Rare human figures look like ants against the backdrop of cyclopean structures. Historians tell us about the long exposure of early cameras, which allegedly erased moving objects. This is another lie for children. Trees in these photos are sharp, shadows are crisp, but there are no people. Cities stand ready but dead. And only decades later do those very settlers, in their strange frame outfits, begin to crawl onto these streets. Here we encounter the theory of global cleansing and subsequent repopulation. Imagine that at the beginning of the 19th century, a catastrophe occurred that destroyed 90% of the Earth's population. It doesn't matter whether it was the nuclear war of 1812, whose aftermath they passed off to us as the Moscow fire and frosts, or a strike from space that caused that very year without a summer, and the clay rain effect that buried the first floors of buildings worldwide. What matters is that the planet's atmosphere changed. The air became poisonous, saturated with electricity and radiation. The survivors, or newly arrived people, found themselves in a hostile environment. And here's where the real nightmare begins. Those who organized the settlement, let's call them curators or the administration, understood that the biological resource was on the brink of extinction. They urgently needed to restore the herd's numbers. In this coordinate system, woman ceased to be a person. She became a biological incubator that had to be kept operational at any cost. The crinoline is not just a Faraday cage. It's a portable life support capsule for the womb. Notice the shape of dresses from that time. A bell. In acoustics and radio engineering, the bell shape is ideal for resonance and damping harmful vibrations. Women were literally placed in sound-insulated, shielded flasks so that the external vibrational background of the destroyed planet wouldn't cause miscarriages and genetic mutations. This explains the rigidity of social norms as well. Why was a woman forbidden to appear in society without a corset and crinoline? Was it equated to public undressing? No. It was a violation of safety protocols. Appearing without protection meant putting valuable biological assets at risk. Public morality was rewritten to meet the needs of species survival. Indecent meant fatally dangerous. The frame could only be removed in specially equipped shielded rooms, bedrooms with thick walls draped in heavy tapestries that also served as insulators. Let's look at the so-called star forts. Official science says they were fortifications for protection against cannon fire. But any artilleryman will tell you that such complex wall geometry is useless against shells. Yet it's ideal for working with wave processes. Star forts were gigantic generators or space harmonizers. And now imagine cities built around these stars. People walking the streets in their resonator suits were not just residents. They were living circuit elements, closing contacts in the city's gigantic microchip. Their clothing was tuned to the operating frequency of these forts. The crinoline captured vibrations from the ground and walls, converting them into a safe background for the body. That's why, when these stations stopped working or were intentionally shut down at the beginning of the 20th century, the need for crinolines disappeared on its own. The field vanished. The protection was no longer needed. But there's one more fact that simply screams of substitution. Door sizes. Look at the doors of St. Isaac's, the entrances to Europe's cathedrals, the gates of old bank and train station buildings. The handles on these doors are at the level of a modern person's head. Stair steps are designed for the stride of a being at least 10 feet tall. We live in giants' houses that we occupied like cockroaches occupy an empty kitchen. And our settler ancestors, who found these crinoline warehouses, possibly used equipment that for giants was something like underwear or light homeware. What for us is a heavy steel cage could have been the finest nanostructure for beings of the previous civilization, supporting the shape of their energy bodies. We wear the gods' cast-offs. We adapted their technologies to our primitive bodies. Birth rate statistics at the end of the 19th century show an anomalous explosion. The population doubled and tripled in mere decades. This is impossible at a level of medicine when surgeons washed their hands only after surgery, not before. The only logical explanation is that the external factor stopped killing. The protection worked. The farm reached design capacity. Women in steel cages fulfilled their task. They carried and gave birth to a new generation of slaves for the new system. And here we come to the most cynical conclusion. All this romance of the 19th century, all these balls, poetry, duels, it's just a facade. A theatrical performance to distract attention while behind the scenes there was harsh selection and herd restoration. We were bred like cattle, provided with the necessary minimum of protection from the environment that the curators themselves might have destroyed. And the crinoline was the main tool in this process. Not a fan, not a hat, but the steel frame without which humanity would simply have died out from radiation sickness or genetic degeneration back in 1850. Do you think this is science fiction? Then explain to me why, in psychiatric institutions of that time, women were forcibly locked into the same constructions, but they called it straitjackets. The principle is the same: restriction of mobility and fixation. Perhaps asylums were not prisons, but quarantine zones for those who received too high a dose of radiation and began to see reality without filters. Those who tore off their frames and screamed that the sky was burning with purple fire and that cities were actually power circuits. They were declared insane and hidden away so they wouldn't scare the rest of the sheep in the herd. We are descendants of survivors in a bunker that we mistakenly call the planet Earth of the 19th century. And our clothing is a memory of that war. But the most terrifying discovery awaits you ahead. If crinolines protected from the ether below, then what protected us from above? And why on antique maps does the sky have a different color? We are approaching the unraveling of why our memory was altered. and we were made to believe that we descended from monkeys, rather than being artificially bred in steel incubators under the skirts of our great-grandmothers. If a woman's lower body was protected by the crinoline, a steel cage, then what happened to the upper part? Look at the accessories. Umbrellas. Ladies of the 19th century never went out without an umbrella. We're told they feared sunburn because pale skin was a sign of aristocracy. This is a laughable explanation for kindergarten. Do you really believe that in cloudy St. Petersburg or London, where the sun is a rare guest, millions of women carried inconvenient rods with domes just for complexion? Number. The umbrella was the upper closing element of the protective circuit. Examine the construction of an antique umbrella. It always had a metal shaft, metal ribs, and a canopy of silk or specially treated fabric. In combination with the crinoline and corset, the umbrella created a complete sphere of safety around the woman. The metal shaft of the umbrella worked as a lightning rod antenna, taking atmospheric discharges from above and diverting them along the outer contour, bypassing the body into the ground, through the conductive elements of the dress or that very cane we discussed earlier. This was not a fashion for paleness. This was the necessity of shielding the head and thyroid gland from hard radiation falling from the sky. That's exactly why umbrellas were so important. Without them, the protection was incomplete, and the dome remained open from above, turning a woman into a live target for an etheric strike. And now, the scariest, the corset. We've been brainwashed to believe women voluntarily broke their ribs and squeezed their internal organs for a wasp waist. This is a lie that reeks of cynicism. The corset is not aesthetics. It is a medical bandage, and at the same time, a grounding bus. In conditions of increased gravity or vibrational shift that could accompany the aftermath of the catastrophe, human internal organs were at risk of prolapse. The corset kept the body toned, serving as an exoskeleton. But there was a second, darker function. Metal plates, bones, were sewn into corsets. They fit tightly against the body, creating reliable contact. This was a terminal block. For the crinoline umbrella system to work, a reliable conductor on the body was needed to connect the top and bottom into a single circuit. Women were literally locked into an electrical circuit where their body played the role of a resistor or capacitor. Ponder the demographic anomaly of the mid-19th century. Where did the millions of orphans come from? Huge orphanages in Moscow, St. Petersburg, London, Paris sprang up like mushrooms after rain. Historians mumble something about high parental mortality and poverty, but the numbers don't add up. City populations grew explosively, while streets were filled with street children. The answer, which will send shivers down your spine, is that the crinolines worked. This was a mass incubation program. Women turned into walking labs for gestating fetuses in a protected environment produced a colossal biomass surge. Possibly, many of these children were taken away right after birth and placed in state institutions for reprogramming consciousness. They were given new history, new memory, new names. This was a generation raised in cages, a generation that knew no true past. We are descendants of this experiment. We are the product of population restoration after the Great Cleansing. That's exactly why it's so hard for us to imagine life without technology. We are genetically dependent on it. Those who survived without crinolines most likely mutated or died. And those who survived were the ones who obediently put on the steel frame. This was natural selection, but artificially directed. Those who refused to wear the fashionable novelty simply left no offspring. Their reproductive systems were burned out by atmospheric ether. Thus, through fashion and so-called voluntary choice, the planetary administration conducted harsh eugenic selection. Only the obedient remained. Those willing to endure discomfort, pain, and restrictions to conform to the norm. Look at photographs of streets after the so-called floods or deluges. First floors are buried in clay, but people on the streets are in clean, perfect outfits. Where did refugees who survived the catastrophe get perfectly starched collars and elaborate dresses with crinolines? Because they weren't refugees. They were personnel deployed to the site for deconservation. They were issued uniforms matching the current physical parameters of the environment. The clay underfoot was alluvial soil after the cataclysm, shielding radiation from below, and the crinoline shielded from above. Everything was thought out to the smallest detail. Recall how crinolines suddenly disappeared. It happened exactly when the first airships and airplanes appeared in the sky, and on the ground, trams and electric lighting. Why? Because the ether was tamed. Atmospheric electricity, which had previously killed, was now driven into wires. The environment stabilized. The need for individual Faraday cages vanished. Women were freed from corsets, not by suffragettes, but by engineers who flipped the switch on the global emitter. As soon as the background dropped to safe levels, wearing 22 pounds of steel on oneself became pointless, and fashion was rewritten immediately. Suddenly, it became fashionable to be natural. But traces of this operation are everywhere. In architecture, in our genetic code, in our strange attraction to metal and shiny objects. We look at old dresses and feel a vague longing. This is not nostalgia. This is genetic memory of safety. Subconsciously, we remember that inside the steel circle, it was calm. Inside the cage, that horror raging outside couldn't reach us. We are the children of those who hid in skirts. In the literal sense of the word. Do you feel how the picture of the world is crumbling? How school history textbooks turn into a collection of fairy tales for the feeble-minded? They hid from us the truth that we were on the brink of extinction. They invented tales about empresses and favorites to conceal the fact of technological control over birth rates. But the main question remains unanswered. If crinolines protected from the ether and the cities were empty, then who turned on this ether? Who created life-incompatible conditions just to later, like a sickly farmer, issue protective suits to the herd? Who pressed the red button? Who turned the planet's atmosphere into an electric chair, forcing survivors to hide in metal cages disguised as voluminous skirts? The answer to this question is the key to understanding our entire reality. We have reached the finale, and now you will see the face of the true puppeteer. It's not kings or presidents. It's those who control technologies for managing planetary climate and etheric fields. Those whom ancient texts called gods, and whom we today might call server administrators. The 19th century was not an age of progress, but an age of harsh, cynical recultivation. The planet was cleansed, washed by that very flood, and then the drying mode was turned on. A high-frequency etheric field designed to evaporate excess moisture and destroy remnants of biological waste. The crinoline was a temporary technical solution. As soon as humidity subsided and the etheric background stabilized thanks to the launch of stationary generating capacities, those very power plants passed off to us as new inventions, the need for individual protective suits vanished. Did you notice that the fashion for metal frames disappeared exactly when cities were entangled with wires? We're told this was electrification, but let's face the truth. Wires are not just energy transport. They are a cage. A global stationary Faraday cage that covered our cities. Previously, each person wore protection on themselves. Now, protection was built around us, driving the ether into the copper veins of cables. We simply swapped the individual spacesuit for life inside a gigantic planetary reactor. Look at the Eiffel Tower. Look at Chukhov's radio towers. These are not just communication masts. These are needles for planetary acupuncture. They pierce into nodal points of the Earth's ley lines, discharging excess voltage into the atmosphere, or, conversely, collecting it. As soon as this global network went operational, the need for crinolines, top hats, and corsets with metal threads disappeared. The system switched to automatic mode. Humanity, like a herd, was moved from the quarantine pen to free grazing, but within fenced territory. We were given the illusion of freedom by removing the heavy hoops from us, but in exchange, we were fitted with invisible collars of dependence on that very system. We laugh at our ancestors who wore steel under their dresses, but look at yourselves. Don't we carry devices with us every day that constantly exchange signals with cell towers? We voluntarily carry beacons in our pockets that register every step we take. The difference is only that the crinoline protected the person from the system, while modern gadgets, on the contrary, connect them directly to it. We have become part of the circuit. If, in the 19th century, a woman in a crinoline was an isolated element, then today each of us is a transistor in the chain. We ourselves have become sources of power and data transmission for those who continue this experiment. The crinoline story proves that the official chronology is fiction. They erased our memory of the catastrophe, replacing it with fairy tales about style changes. They invented culture, art, and fashion for us to explain purely utilitarian survival actions. We are a civilization of amnesia. We walk streets built by giants, live in houses that were communication stations, and wear clothing that is a degraded version of protective suits. A wedding dress is cargo cult. School uniform is incubator uniform. A man's tie around the neck is a symbolic remnant of that very grounding strap that once saved lives and now just presses on the throat, reminding of slavery. Why am I telling you this? Because the cycle is repeating. Look around. The world is once again on the threshold of grandiose changes. Climate anomalies, strange diseases, talks of a new normal, digital currencies, metaverses. Doesn't it seem to you that we're being prepared again for a change of fashion? Perhaps soon they'll offer us to wear some protective suits again, be it digital avatars or new types of clothing with embedded electronics. And they'll explain it to us again as care for safety or a new trend. But now you know the truth. You know that behind every global change in appearance lies a physical necessity for survival in conditions artificially created for us. The Great Reset has already happened, and more than once. The 19th century was the time when humanity was restarted after a crash. The crinoline is the symbol of this restart. It is proof that we were on the brink of destruction and survived only thanks to technologies whose meaning we have lost. We look at old photos and see not fashionistas, but stalkers of the exclusion zone. We see heroes who, in inhuman conditions, managed to carry and give birth to us. A generation that forgot its real parents and began to worship history textbooks written by the victors. Don't let yourself be deceived again. When they tell you that a new technology or new clothing is needed for beauty or convenience, look for the double bottom. Look for the technical task. Look for what they're trying to protect you from, or, conversely, expose you to. The history of the crinoline teaches us the main thing. In this world, nothing is random. Every fold in an empress's dress, every button on a soldier's uniform, every spire on a cathedral roof. These are elements of a single, complex, and sometimes ruthless machine. A machine that is still working. We live in a matrix built on the ruins of the Golden Age. And perhaps, right now, as you read these lines, somewhere in secret facilities they are already preparing new patterns for our reality. Whether it will be steel cages again, or something worse, depends on how quickly we wake up. Study the past not through books, but through engineering blueprints. Look at paintings as schematics. And then, perhaps, the next time the sky ignites with electric fire again, you will know what to do to survive without turning into obedient people in pretty packaging.